Is it worthwhile to have 8 calves in a 32 max frontline setup? It's kind of outside the scope of this specific campaign, but we can talk about like army composition for a little while if you guys are interested. So let me just talk about why Cav are bad. Cav are bad. Cav are just bad in this game. Okay, they're bad. They are not as good as infantry, and they're not as good as cannons. There are use cases, and yes, there are outliers. You could have a scenario like playing as Poland, where you have 73% cavalry combat ability. And in that case, they're freaking awesome, obviously, but that's because they have 73% combat ability. The problem is that if you have 27 combat width, and you have 27 infantry and 4 cav, which would be the ideal amount for flanking, and the way you can tell that is if you look at your actual units. This information is not readily displayed, by the way. You need to play the game way too much to know what I'm talking about here, but let me explain it with a cavalry unit. If you hover over an actual cavalry unit, you can see their stats, right? They have one, in this case, our cav have 1 offensive fire pip, 0 defensive fire pips, 2 offensive shock, 1 defensive shock, 2 offensive morale, 2 defensive morale, flanking range 2. What that means is that they can attack the unit in front of them, the unit to the right of them, and the unit 2 to the right of them, 1 to the left of them, 2 to the left of them. That's their default range. They can target 5 units, okay? Later on in the game, as you get more and more increased flanking range, this is a multiplier. It's an additive multiplier on top of the base flanking range. So right now, we have a flanking range of 2 plus 25%. 2 plus 25% would be 2.5. What Paradox does is round down to 2. So getting Tech 10 doesn't help you really at all. Your cav can still only flank 2 tiles. But when you get to Tech 18, now they'll have plus 50%. 2 plus 50% equals 3. Now they can flank and actually hit 7 targets. So they can hit 1 in front of them, 3 to the right, 3 to the left. So what they're supposed to do is if you have a front line of 6 and a cav there, they'll deploy on the very exterior of the army, and then they'll flank in as many tiles as they're able to. Now, there's a number of problems with the EU4 combat system that make cavalry suck, and I'm going to keep talking about those since we're talking about this apparently. But number one is that the cav themselves are 2.5 times expensive as an infantry. So you're paying 250% as much money for this unit. It does not do 250% more damage. It does about the same amount of damage. You can tell by looking at these actual numbers. In the infantry fire, in the fire phase, which comes before shock, the infantry do 0.8 as a damage multiplier at this current level of tech. In the shock phase, they have a multiplier of 1.15. The average overall damage multiplier then of an infantry is going to be, and let's just switch over to center monitor so you can see the calculator here, 0.8 times 0.5, because you're in the fire phase half the time, plus 1.15 times 0.5. The average damage multiplier, not factoring in the very minuscule advantage they have in that fire comes before shock, so they kind of like do more damage in the first phase of combat. Just saying, again, straight up on average, they have an average damage multiplier of 0.975. Now with the cav, they do 0.5 half of the time, and then in the shock phase, they do 2 half of the time. So their average damage multiplier right now is 1.25. They do more damage on average than a infantry. The problem is that if you compare what they actually do, 1.25 divided by 0.975, they do 28.2% more damage than the infantry do. But they cost 250% more. So if you factor that in, they are half as good as one infantry. You could field more infantry and do more than with the cav. Now, the use case scenario where cav are actually good is if you are low on force limit and you need to max out your actual damage ability, in which case going over the force limit would hurt your economy. So in that case, if you have like 8 force limit, you could run like a 5-3 composition and the cav actually hit really hard for their force limit. But if you're not limited on force limit, you're better off just having 3 infantry instead of 1 cav. On top of that, it gets worse. The cav themselves are not smart enough to actually do their job. If you deploy, say, 20 infantry and you have 4 cav, 4 on each side. Let me like maybe a spreadsheet would be a good way to go with this. Let's just turn this into a grid so we can like try to give an example here. With our current tech, our cav can flank by 2, so they can hit this target here. I don't really know how to indicate that clearly, but like they can hit this guy straight across, which doesn't exist. They can hit 1 across, 1 in, and then 2. So this cav can target these 2 guys here. This guy can only hit this target. So that means that these cav are deployed in a way that you're paying 2.5 times as much money to do, on average, 26 or whatever % more damage, assuming no other multipliers to cav damage and stuff. Again, please do not take this out of context and say, Arumba's a dumbass because he doesn't realize how great Polish cavalry can be. Well, no shit. Obviously, Polish cavalry are goddamn awesome. But that's because they have ridiculous combat modifiers. Without them, in a straight-up one-on-one comparison, cav are awful. Okay, so this is what they can do. Now, the problem is that, let's say, over the course of, say, 2 or 3 combat phases, because this target here is getting engaged by this infantry, this cavalry, and this cavalry, they always target the closest part. He's not going to like target this one first. These 2 cav gang up on this guy, and then once he's dead, let's say he just gets removed, now this cav, he's completely useless now. Because he routed the exterior unit, and he can only flank by 2, he is now unable to engage. This infantry by default have a flanking range of 1, so they can target directly in front of them, and 1 more over. He will start targeting here, the cav will start working on this guy. So now you've got 2 infantry plus 1 cav working on this target. Once he is dead, your cav literally just sit around doing nothing for the rest of combat. This infantry now, because he only has 1 flanking range, can only target directly in front of him and 1 tile in. He can't do anything either. What should happen is that he should move back into the back row like this, and this guy should move back. The cav should come in by 1, both. This guy now gets to engage because he's within range. And honestly, I would take it a step further and say that cav, if they are trying to do this like theoretical mechanic that I wish they would implement in the game, if cav are trying to push their way in to flank, I think cav should supersede priority over infantry that are trying to flank, because that's what they do. So I would actually say that this guy should also get pulled back. And then they both would push in again. And this should be a thing that updates every day of combat. And now this guy can re-engage, and this guy can re-engage. And if they were to pincer the enemy and actually flank like they're supposed to, cav would be good. But because they don't, and they just only affect combat until the exterior units in the army are dead, they are dead weight most of the time. They're extremely expensive compared to what they do. For just like what? Okay, a cav is 25 ducats, a cannon is 30 ducats. So for 20% more, you could have a cannon which deploys in the back row here, which I probably shouldn't have used C for cavalry, I guess artillery. You could have an artillery in the back row that will always be useful. Always just pummeling whatever's in front of it. They also have the same flanking range as cavalry, so an artillery can target here and these 2 as well. It has a 5 range. It can go 5 tiles to begin with. But then once you're out of combat, the artillery have a practical use. They can be used for sieges. Instructions unclear, cav in the middle. Does artillery on the edges of the battlefield also only fire on the target directly opposing them? Yes, exactly. They can only engage within their flanking range, and they will not move toward the center. Do you get an advantage over the enemy for having a longer combat width? Whichever country has the higher combat width from technology determines the combat width of the engagement. So if I have a combat width of 27, and the enemy has a combat width of 25, we both have a combat width of 27. Whatever the max value of combat width is between the 2 countries that are engaged in combat determines the actual combat width. Hordes are incredible because of cav? No. Now, okay, there is another factor, right? I made a very, very basic comparison in the value of the cavalry units and what they can actually do versus infantry. Now, there is something to consider, which is that oftentimes the total number of pips that an infantry will have versus the total number of pips that a cavalry will have will be different. So for example, right now, at our current level of tech, we have a choice between two different types of infantry, both of which have the exact same number of total pips. Your choice is just how do you want to allocate them. So we could have 1 fire offensive, 2 defensive fire, 2 shock offensive, 1 defensive, 3 morale offensive, 1 morale defensive. What really matters though is the total pips. We have 3 plus 3 plus 4. So 3 plus 3 plus 4 equals 10. Okay? What about the Cav at our current tech? Our Cav have 1 plus 3 plus 4. So because we are a Western tech nation, and this is quite common, our Cav right this moment actually have fewer total pips than the infantry by two less pips. So at our current level of tech, Cav actually have fewer pips, but that's probably because we're just about to take a tech right next level that gives us the upgraded Cav. So there are sweet spots where your Cav might actually have more total pips than your infantry. And one of the main reasons why Horde Cavalry are so amazing is because they are Horde tech group. Their Cav have more pips than like Western tech units. Let me give an example. It's just, you guys have really opened up the rabbit hole, or gone down the rabbit hole here. EU4 wiki unit types. So the reason why the Cav from the Hordes are so good at the beginning of the game is not because Cavalry are good. Cavalry are still bad. It's just that if you compare Western tech units to Horde units at the beginning of the game, you'll see why. So right now, if you look at, say, Western tech, that is these guys. The total number of pips on your infantry at the beginning of the game are right here. So we got a graph here. It goes, these are groups of 4, so this would be 2. Western tech infantry start off with 2 pips. And then here they bump up to 3. Here they bump up to 5. Then they stay at 5. Then they bump up to 10. Right? That's where we are right now. We're Western tech. We have 10 pips on our infantry, around tech 12. For techs 13 and 14, we stay at 10 pips. At tech 15, we're going to bump up to 12. Great, yeah? Nomads, this green line here, what we care about is actually... Let's open that up in another tab. We can have both open at the same time. So unit pips by tech level infantry, unit pips by tech level cavalry. If you're comparing a nomad tech group cavalry, they start up here. A nomad classed cavalry starts off with 6 pips versus the Western tech at 2 pips on their infantry. So again, that's why the Cav are good. It's not because cavalry themselves as a unit type are good. It's because the disparity in tech group that causes a specific type of cavalry to have advantageous pips in a specific period of time. Now, if you look at the nomad stuff, they start off really strong, and it's kind of hard to follow this line. That darkish blue line goes up to here, then to here, then to here. Right around, say, tech 15 or so, they have 12 pips. We go back to the infantry. Right around tech 15 or so is when the Western tech infantry suddenly get 15 pips also. And so later on in the game, you'll constantly see the nomads start to fall behind because they have a pip advantage in the beginning of the game on their units, and then they start to fade off on their pips. I think they also have a slight benefit to their infantry as well. Yeah, they start off with 4 pips on their infantry versus only 2 pips on the Western infantry. Right there, that blue line there, that's the nomads, and this is the Western tech right here. So that's what really does it. High American is it's like a mythological thing you can start off as. They're super overpowered. It's supposed to represent like Aztec invasion, imported saves, that kind of thing. So I didn't really intend for this to be the main topic of the stream today, but do you guys see why I hate Cav? Cav are expensive. They don't practically serve any purpose in most combat scenarios. And again, let's take it to an extreme now. Let's say that late game, would you rather, if we have a combat width of 40, there's 40 combat width. 40 combat width is the max in the game. So if I'm coming at you, right, and this is my army, I just run 40 infantry and 40 artillery, the total cost is going to be 40 times the base price of 10 ducats equals 400 ducats worth of infantry. If I run 40 artillery, it's very expensive. That's 30 ducats. That's going to be 1,200 ducats in artillery. Let's say that this other guy is like a Cav guy. He loves Cav. He thinks Cav are amazing. And he sees that in his interface, he's allowed to have as many as 50% cavalry to infantry ratio. He knows that if he loses some of his infantry, that his cavalry will take a hit to their tactics. So he doesn't want to run exactly 50-50. Let's say he runs like 30 infantry and 10 cavalry. So the 5 over here become cavalry. We'll leave them green just to indicate that they are engaged in combat, I guess, instead of using this like color thing that I was doing up here. That was dumb. All right, so now his outlay is going to be 30 infantry, x10 equals 300 ducats. He has, this up a little bit, 10 cavalry, x25 base ducats equals 250 ducats. And then for argument's sake, let's say that we have the same economy and he also runs 40 cannons. If I can run it, he can run it. So 40 cannons, x30 equals 1,200 more ducats in artillery. So the total expense for our two armies ends up being this. He's got 300 plus 250 plus 1,200. So he spent 1,750 ducats to build his army, and I've spent 1,600 ducats. Not a very big difference in actual price, right? The problem is that because by the time you can actually field a full combat width of 40 artillery, the pip disparity between infantry and cavalry is largely negated. What ends up happening is that these guys are going to take a lot more effective damage than the infantry on my side, right? Because we're going to do about the same amount of damage to each other. I'm effectively doing more damage because if our pips end up normalized and the effective damage in the fire and shock phase averages out so that infantry and cavalry do about the same amount of damage, and they're actually engaged in head-to-head battles like this, which is what happens in the late game, then even though we do the same amount of damage, I'm damaging a unit that costs 2.5 times as much ducats to buy and 2.5 times as much to reinforce, which means that my effective damage to his economy is 250% higher for the units on the outside that are doing their damage here. Now, if I'm a smart player, I'm going to probably take the money I saved by not hiring Cav and have some extras. I can take 150 ducats to hire an extra 15 infantry. That's 150 ducats in reserves. If I then deploy my reserve infantry here, which don't actually show up on the combat screen, they show up in the game. If you're in battle, there's like a little, you can hover over the actual infantry, total infantry number, and it'll show number in reserves. So let's just say that I have 15 infantry in reserves like this. Let's count them up. We've got 22 right now. Let's go down to 15 right there. Now it doesn't matter where I actually put them. Like I mean, you could imagine them there, you could imagine them there. It doesn't make any difference. Say that this guy gets killed, right? Or maybe this guy, it doesn't matter. They're all going to die at basically the exact same rate at this point. But if these guys die because the cavalry do more damage, again, they do more damage. They do. They have a higher overall damage dealt than the infantry do. But it's not worth the 250% price. So probably these guys are going to get weaker first because they're up against cavalry that are hurting them a little bit more. But as soon as they run out of total morale, or the unit itself, the regiment itself dies, let's say they just get completely stack wiped, like not stack wiped because that doesn't actually happen in battle unless the whole army dies. But if they go down to 0 regiment strength or 0 morale, then they'll quit the battle effectively. They die, right? It doesn't matter where in the battle this actually happens. If you have reserve infantry, they will hop in front of the artillery in the back row. They'll just hop right there. And now you have 5 more infantry in both sides that hop in at 100% strength and guard the cannons in the back row. Now, I can promise you this, 1 cavalry cannot beat 2 infantry. And I think you probably know that from experience. 1 cavalry will lose to 2 infantry. Is it manpower efficient? That could be an argument for cavalry as well. They pack a lot of punch in a single unit, and then also they are more manpower efficient. But manpower is not usually an issue, and you can always hire merc infantry. In which case, manpower efficiency is not really something to really worry about too much. Granted, if you're comparing merc infantry to cavalry, it's a closer comparison. But still, these cav are now going to get wrecked because they've had to fight 2 turns, or 2 phases worth of infantry. So once they get weak, and then they bow out... By the way, since I bought these extra 150 ducats worth of units, we both spent the exact same amount of money, right? He spent 1750 to hire the 10 cav, and I've spent 1750 for my reserve infantry. Because if we're trying to use like a finite comparison to compare relative army strengths to each other, you can't really just say, well, he'll have reserve infantry too. No, we're trying to make it a comparison where if I have to spend exactly this much money, which composition is the most cost effective? I would also make the argument that, sure, this takes more force limit and more manpower, but it's also more effective outside of combat. Because you have more bodies to siege provinces, you have more bodies to suppress rebels, you have more bodies to earn you more professionalism if you're drilling, because it fills up more of your total force limit. But again, after they have to fight their first round of infantry, these cav will end up having to quit because they'll run out of morale or run out of units. And when they do, because he has no reserves, because he can't afford them, what happens to the artillery? You guys know this, I'm sure, from experience. The artillery are forced into the front row. They can't stay in the back row just because they want to. And this is probably not known by everyone, but did you guys know that artillery do 50% damage when they're in the second row and 100% damage when they're in the front row? And artillery that's deployed in the back row, it's kind of misleading because it makes it look like artillery do this full amount of damage. That's only if they're in the front row. When they're in the back row, they do half damage in both phases. So an artillery in the second row does half of what you would expect. But if the artillery does get forced into the front row, they will do full damage from the front row, but they also take double damage in the front row. So that's like their weakness. You obviously don't want them to be in the front row, but it's one of the reasons why trying to run a lot of artillery in the early game before they get their multipliers is actually really expensive. So now that the artillery have been pushed into the front row, because again, we've only spent the same amount of money to try to keep it equal, these guys take double damage, which means that they fold real quick. They get killed super fast. So now they're gone. I have no cav, and because of our current, or again, we're using our current level of tech to demonstrate flanking range, my infantry here is going to be hitting this guy directly across. This guy can only flank in by 1. Artillery can flank in by 2 by default, so this artillery is going to engage that infantry. This artillery is going to also engage that infantry. These guys over here are not, like, destroyed, but I'm going to do this to represent now that they can't engage. They're outside of engagement range. So this ends up being the visual representation of who is able to actually engage now. The fact that I have no cav, as you can see, doesn't matter. What would I gain if I had run cav myself? They can't engage either, right? We're talking about at most, because the cav are not smart enough to bully their way in towards the center like this, means that I could maybe have one cav here. If this were a cav, he'd be able to hit that target, but because he's infantry, he can't. If cav had priority, and if I did have a cav over here, and he looks to his immediate right or left, depending on which side of the flank he's on, but he looks to this guy and says, "Hey, are you shooting someone?" And he's like, "No, dog, I can't hit anyone. I can't see them. They're too far away." All right, get out of my way. And he would just bully his way in by 1 tile. And then the very next day, he would look at this guy and say, "Hey, are you shooting anything?" "No, man, I can't do it." "All right, cool. I'm gonna push in. Got it. I'm gonna move." And then he asks the next guy. "Nope." So then he's here. And now he can start hitting. And what should happen is, again, say that I actually had 2 cav here. So far, they would have been moving in by 1 move, 1 tile each single day. This guy is going to be engaged in combat, so he's not going to be looking to move, right? He'd be like, "Well, yeah, I'm good. I can't move. I'm shooting someone, so I'm not going to do my logic to try to push in." But this guy is looking at, I can hit this, or this. I'm not able to hit anything. So he looks to the right guy and he says, "Hey, dude, are you hitting something?" And he's like, "Yeah, I'm hitting something." "Okay, but could you still hit it if you moved in?" Yeah, obviously I could do that, duh. And then, so he would trigger this cav to be like, "Hey, are you hitting something?" And he'd say, "Yeah, I am." "Okay, but there's a guy to my left who's a cavalry, and you're just an infantry, so I'm more important right now because I'm a flanker and you're just an infantry. So even though you are hitting something, I'm going to overrule you and I'm going to push you out too, because there's another cavalry that wants to engage. If that other cavalry were not there, then this extra turn, this extra move shouldn't happen, right? This infantry should stay here. If I only had one cavalry, these two should keep pushing in, so they're both engaging that outermost flank over and over and over again as they route the whole line. But if I have multiple cav, then it should change so that these two end up pushing in, and then say this guy dies, and then the artillery is forced forward, and then they kill the artillery. And now this cav is like, okay, I'm out. I can't hit anything else anymore. And then they both push in and replace that infantry. Where does the infantry go? The infantry should fall back into the reserves. He should now be here, ready to step in. How did it green? Yeah, it should be green there. Ready to step in. Maybe even, oh my God, surprise, surprise, shocking. He basically goes back and then to the front line. And if these guys are all getting weak and then they die, the reserves do their job and reinforce the front line to protect your artillery. How many times have you seen your artillery? You're winning a battle, the frontline army, like you run out of infantry, you've got all these idiots sitting on the corners, the cav are just screwing off doing nothing. And then the artillery are all forced forward one row, and you're like, well, shit, I'm gonna win the fight. I'm gonna win the fight, but my artillery taking double damage now, and I've got infantry that aren't smart enough to fall back into reserves and then move into the front line to defend the artillery. But to clearly state again how I think that it should work is my kind of joking method of saying the cav should look to the guy that he's standing next to and say, hey, are you hitting something? And if he says no, then get out the way. Now, the only drawback to implementing a new system like this would be that if reinforcements were to arrive, then the enemy reinforcements would deploy on the exterior, right? Because they would fill in, infantry would fill in here, etc. Say suddenly a new army arrives. The enemy allies were late to the party, and so they've brought more troops to the front line. And all of a sudden, the battle widens up again. I would also say that if the cav are pushing in, maybe, possibly, there should be even more logic that says, if, here, let me make it clear. We had the cavalry out here, and we had infantry that were here. And this was before these guys had arrived, so just pretend like these guys aren't here yet. If these cavalry are pushing in, they should be swapping positions with the infantry. To start with, they should go like that, and then, because they pushed in by two, the infantry that was here should now be here. You got swapped over to the edge, pushed out so the cav can do their job. And then, at the same time, the infantry should be saying, there's nothing for me to shoot at. Can't hit anything. Oh, there's no artillery behind me. Again, pretend like there aren't any artillery on the exterior here. There's nobody for me to protect. I'm going to fall back into the reserves and maybe reinforce in the center if I'm needed to protect the other artillery. Right? He should fall back to protect. He should just join the reserves. But if he looks behind him and says, I don't have anything to shoot, but there's an artillery behind me, I'll stay. Because I'm protecting my artillery, because I'm defending a very, very valuable and expensive piece of equipment behind me, the regiment's behind me, I'll stay even though I can't shoot anything. So what would end up happening if that were the logic is that then these cav would push in again on the next day, and the infantry ends up over here. And again, in this case, yellow is representing that they can't actually hit anything. There's nothing for them to target. So by the end of it, the cav end up over here, and the infantry end up over here, unable to engage. And then the reinforcements were to arrive, again, like for example. Then you end up in a situation where all of a sudden everyone's engaged in combat. Your cav have kind of pushed into the center a little bit, and they don't really want to be here, right? Because cav always tried to deploy on the exterior. They try to deploy in a position where they don't take any damage. So you might say, as a disadvantage to this change that I'm suggesting would be better, that now your cav are taking hits that they shouldn't otherwise take. But I would argue that whether they're here taking hits or they're here taking hits, they're still going to take some damage no matter what. As long as the artillery stay defended, I wouldn't care if the cav, in the situation where reinforcements arrive, if the cav take damage. if reinforcements don't arrive, if they never show up, and this whole thing just stays bare on both sides, then over time, your cav, if you had them, should just continue to chew away these lines. And at the end of the combat, you'd actually end up with something that looks like this. Let's say they've destroyed all of this, and now you're down to here, and, you know, whatever. At the very end, your cav end up all the way in the center. And all of these guys over on the sides end up being unable to engage. But because the cav have been pushing the infantry back to the sides, then the infantry still defend the artillery, and then the combat ends. Now I'm going to read chat and see if you guys are actually mad at me for all the EXL. I know we have an Excel emote because you guys actually do like Excel sometimes, and it didn't need to be done in Excel. I just found it to be the easiest way to explain things. We got it, thanks. But Arumba, what about Poland?